what we've seen is that LLMs can answer, but LLMs can also hallucinate a lot. And LLMs can confidently hallucinate, and hallucination is a dangerous liability, especially in the medical domain. So now we need to get LLMs to do the right thing. How do we go about doing this? So for starters, it's very important to select LLMs that's unique, particularly for a certain domain. Now, how do you select an LLM? If you look at Twitter or LinkedIn, there's a lot of evaluations and new models coming up, and people talking about this new model beats the benchmark of another model, and so on and so forth. But there is an evaluation that I've really enjoyed looking at, which is called as the facts uh, evaluation. And I think if I'm not wrong, it was spearheaded by the Google research team. Now, as part of facts, what it starts to look at is not just about if your answer is right, but it also looks at, is it factual in terms of how it's generating the answer, and how good is it at providing the right answer. So there's a facts leaderboard. I think you can check on Kaggle, and you can look at the models that you think are factually right. And there's also the sensitivity between temperature, right? So if you have, when you want to write emails and you want to craft messages, you might need more creativity, which is essentially a higher temperature. But when you want more factual reasoning, you might be required to use a much lesser temperature. Now, the next thing, which is prompt engineering. And in prompt engineering, the patterns, there are lots of different patterns that work. The prompt engineering guides from Google Research, Anthropic, I think they're very valuable for you to take a look at. And then it's quite extensive, so you need to figure out what parts you want to make use of. So how you design your prompts before you send to an LLM, that becomes very important. And the last bit is actually the grounding and the validation. So as part of grounding and validation, you want to make sure your LLM is not hallucinating. So the first thing that you can do is, when you provide a prompt to an LLM where you say, given these documents, given this query, I want, these are your set of instructions, you can force an LLM to always have a claim. That is basically what an LLM is claiming is the answer, and a source associated with it. Now you can deconstruct every claim and source pairs. And for each of these pairs, you could then validate if the claim is right or wrong. Now, how do you actually do that verification? So the simple natural language method, which is you just try to identify the nouns and the verbs and see if it makes sense. And then if it does, then you give it a pass. Or there is the advanced natural language inference method, right? So where you have the premise, which is basically the data that we're getting from the source that's injected into the LLM. And then you have the hypothesis, which is the claim that the LLM is making based on that source. So your NLI will try to identify and come up with an understanding if it's entailment, contradiction, or neutral. So if it's entailment, which means that the LLM is not really hallucinating. If it's contradicting, then you know that an LLM is trying to make up something that is against the source. If it's neutral, then you're in a position where you can either accept nor deny. And this is a very important part that you need to have before you show the answer or the response to the user, because if you can't validate the response coming from an LLM, you don't really know what you're feeding back to the user is right or wrong. Now, based on that, you can take actions, and your actions can be depending on what sort of entailment, contradiction, and neutrality you have. You can remove certain parts of the LLM, parts of the response, and then use only the parts that matched entailment, and then construct a final answer before sending it back to the user. Now, the last bit is providing output guardrails. Now, your output guardrails make sure that you're adhering to the role. Basically, you don't want to send back information where you're telling the doctor do this and that, but your duty here is to help the doctor understand all the different cases. You're looking at toxicity and bias filtering. So you sort of put different guardrails, and there are good ways to implement guardrails as well. There are a lot of good libraries that have come out, and you can implement output guardrails, and the output guardrails could also have certain format that you want to keep before you send your response back.